My plan was to use my router on my new router table. You mount the router upside down in the table, clamp it in, and then you can just run your pieces of timber through. There's a fence that holds them down to stop them slipping up, and one at the front stops them pulling out. And they're quite light, you just run them through. Quite straightforward. It's similar to using a spindle moulder machine, which I've used before. Unfortunately, my router, it turns out, doesn't fit the router table. The base has got a diameter of 170, but then this little section's cut away, which gives 155. The dimension I found online when buying it was 155. So the router table I got goes up to 162, but it's actually the total diameter that's the important thing. So the two don't fit together, which means I'm having to do the cutting handheld. That's a lot harder to control because you've got to hold a heavy tool on a small bit of timber and it can rock. You've got to sort of, the more you use it, the more you get used to the feel of it. And I'm quite new to it, so it takes a bit of getting used to. I've also got to find a way to hold my timber. You can't just hold the one against the other. This needs to be used two hands. So I need to clamp this down somehow. I've got a workbench with a couple of little rubber stops, but unfortunately the guide fouls the stops, so I can't use that. So instead I can put it in my vise. The workbench is higher than the vise, so I had to put the guide on the opposite side to how it shows in the instructions. And I've also got to make sure that this is as high as I can possibly get it, while still giving enough for it to be held. So I put it in about 8-10 mil. It holds the timber okay, and it gives me enough room for the guide. It was quite tricky to set this up actually. I put the guide on the right as it shows, as I say, but it fouled the bench, so I put it on the other side. That was the first thing. There's also a little chip deflector, but I decided to mount the dust nozzle, which allows me to fit a vacuum cleaner into the other side. As it turns out, as you run this through to here, the vacuum cleaner nozzle, which is a hard curve, fouls against the wall, so there isn't enough space. I also had to take the bit out to put this on, having already set it up. So instead of taking it all out to put the chip deflector back on, I've just got my goggles on instead. So, I've cut a test piece. To start off with, my grooves went down and up and out and in because I was wobbling the tool a bit, but I've made a much cleaner cut now and I'm quite happy. This is a plunge router, which means you can press it down. When you start off, the cutter doesn't cut into the wood at all, so if I was to put this here and slide it forwards and backwards, it wouldn't make a cut. But as I push it down, whilst it's spinning, it'll go into the wood. I've got a depth stop set, so it stops at 6 mil. That's set up with all of this here, and that gives me the correct depth for my spacers, which I'll put in later. And in from the edge, I've got the guide here set to 4 mil, so there's a 4 mil gap in between here and the cutter. I'm going to have to do 2 passes to make my rebate, because I want a 35 mil rebate and it's a 25 mil cutter. So I'm going to do one just in from the edge and then another one. If my timber was larger, I wouldn't be able to use the guide on the left hand side, because you need to work the router in from the right hand side because of the way the blade spins. But because I've got a small piece of timber, I can do my centre cut and do my right hand cut, and I can still have the guide on the left. So that's how I set it up. All I have to do now is cut it. I've got my face on the front and my edge mark here, so I know that I'm cutting this way because this is the edge that's going to be seen. So all being well, it should be 4mm in from the front. Spot on. And my groove should be 6mm, which it is. There's a very slight little cutter groove there. That's because as I get towards the end of the timber, the plate tips with the weight of the tool. I have to keep my weight to the back. I'm getting better. There won't be a problem because I'll be putting the spacers in which will conceal that. So as long as it's pretty smooth all the way along, it's fine for what I need. I've done 3 now. Another 5 to cut. I switched to using the Hoover attachment there because it was kicking out quite a bit of dust. I managed to get the piece just far enough over so that I had the space. Still quite a lot of dust, so if I was cutting hardwood I'd wear a mask and I'll clean it up before anyone cooks dinner since it's explosive. I've done the first rebate on all 8 pieces, so now I need to do the second one. And I'll set my guide so that my bit runs along there. And do 8 of those, and then I'll be ready to glue it all together, or at least to check, and then hopefully glue it all together. Now the pieces have all got the rebate in, I'm just going to give them a sand. I've got a piece of sandpaper under my bench hook so it stays put pretty much flush with the edge of the bench, and I'm just going to hook the edge, the front of my piece, over the side and run them up and down just to smooth off any imperfections from the router cuts. I'll run over them all with an 80 grit and then with a 120 grit to make them a bit smoother. Well, the rebates are all sanded now. I've also run over the 4 edges of the faces I'm going to be gluing just to get rid of any burrs so they fit neatly. I've also given all pieces a brush over, especially on the end, with a towel to get rid of any loose sawdust, which would stop the glue working effectively. So it's time to put it together now. It's actually looking a lot more like what it should. You can see where the pieces will come in from the back. You can see the lip I've made with the rebate. To clamp it together, I've invested in this rather funky tool. I was watching videos of how people make frames, since this is my first one, and I saw these band clamps. So I went and picked one up. They're not very expensive. It's got 4 right-angled corners, and it's got a long section of tape. You put it round one of the right angles on each corner, pull it tight, tighten it up, bingo. You don't have to mess about with clamps on all corners. And then to make sure it's square, my combination square is a bit too big to go in the centre, so I've got this little 2-inch engineer's square which I can put up against the side, fits quite nice and neatly inside, and check it's all square. And then I will just put something heavy on top. I'll do this one tonight, leave it overnight, and I'll do the other one in the morning before I go to work. I tend to use my fingers for glue because I'm a bit of a liability with glue, so whatever I do it goes everywhere. So I might as well just face up and get it on my fingers right from the start. So I've put that just to pull tight. Just check now for square. It's good on that corner. Pretty good there, which means you would expect the other two all look good. I can do another check because all the pieces are the same size. It should measure the same across the diagonals. Just over 355. Just under 355. So it looks like it needs to come in that way a little. I don't think it's going to do that, but a mil is not bad. 354.5. Yeah, it's now measuring 354.5. Because it's just a small square, it hasn't quite got the accuracy over the area. There's a bigger one, hence the double check. It's lifting up slightly at that end, but I'm going to weight it down anyway. So I'll weight it down by hand while I tighten this up. As long as it's not twisted, it doesn't matter too much if there's a little step in my miters, because I'm going to plane it. It's not bad. I'm not entirely sure how much you're supposed to tighten this up, but I think I'll leave it at that. So my bench hook will sit over the top. And it seems apt to use the router box to weight it down. It's plenty heavy enough. And there we go. That's the first frame assembled. I've glued both the frames now. The first one turned out quite well, so I'm just going to reveal the second. Not bad. The first one's better. This one's got a small gap in the top, but I might put a bit of wood filler in. Tiny bit of tilt on that one. Tiny bit of tilt on both. But I'm planning to plane it anyway. Before I do that though, at the moment it's just flat faces glued together, which, although the glue is strong, it can be reinforced with a little bit of dowel. So I'm going to drill a hole in on each side and the same on the bottom, and put a bit of dowel in. I want to be careful not to drill into my rebate, so the outside of my timber is .35, so I'll halve that. 17.5. And go exactly halfway down, and I'll put my hole in as far as here, so the dowel's half in each piece of timber, so that's the same as the overall width of timber, which is 41mm. Eventually the dowel pieces will be the top and bottom, so that when you see the frame from the edge you won't see the dowel. Makes sense to clamp it in the vise to do the drilling. I put a bit of tape on my drill bit to make sure I don't overshoot or not go far enough. I've got a wood drill bit, so hopefully it won't squelch out the timber. I've already cut my dowel. I've cut them to 50mm, which is slightly longer than the hole. That means that I can cut off the end and then I'll plane round and it'll all be smooth. All the holes are drilled, so I'm going to glue the dowel in now. I'll do the second one now and then I'll leave them both to dry before planing.